My name is Gabby. I'm the organizing director for the Oregon Student Association. And today we're really glad to have our final series of the virtual teach-ins that we've been doing for the last few weeks. So this one, we're going to be doing a panel. So we will be introducing our panel a little bit later. But just to kind of go through some of the logistics of the teach-in today, is that we are going to go through a history of the student movement timeline. And so the timeline will highlight some key components of college and student-based activism and organizing. And then from there, we will be going into an introduction of the panel, which I'm super excited for a lot of these powerhouse folks to be here with us today. And then we're gonna have an open Q&A. And so I have some questions and I really want you all to, all the participants to also engage and feel free to throw questions that come up from the timeline. We'll give a few minutes for the timeline to debrief it and talk about some comments and things that we observed from the timeline. And then also a Q&A with the panel. So throwing in the chat or do the raise hand feature for questions that you want to ask the panel. And then the panel will give some time to respond to those questions. So let's get started with the timeline. All right, great. So the first one that we want to look at here is People versus Wheaton College in 1866. So in one of the earliest judicial articulations of the relationship between universities and students, Wheaton College suspended a student, E. Hartley Pratt, for joining a secret society. This case was called the People versus Wheaton College, 1866. And the Court of Illinois found in favor of the college, which started a conversation around the rights that universities had over their student attendees. The next one that we want to highlight here is in the 1930s, and this is when the American Student Union formed. During its peak years from spring 1936 to spring 1939, the movement mobilized at least 500,000 college students, about half of the American student body at the time, in an annual 1-hour strike against war. The movement also organized students on behalf of extensive reform agendas, which included federal aid to education, government job programs for youth, abolition of the compulsory reserves officers, training corps, ROTC, academic freedom, racial equality, and collective bargaining rights. And as I mentioned before, if any questions come up about the timeline or comments, feel free to throw them in the chat. 1951, the Campus Crusade for Christ, founded at UCLA by Bill and Vonnet Bright. CCC's mission is to help build spiritual movements everywhere, so everyone knows someone who truly follows Jesus Christ. Today, Campus Crusades for Christ has more than 27,000 staff members and 225,000 volunteers working across 190 different countries. In 1960, on February 1st, 4 North Carolina agricultural and technical college students sat down at a Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and wait for service. Over the course of the sit-in movement, more than 78 cities participated, where there were over 50,000 Black and white protesters and 2,000 participants were arrested. Also in 1960, the founding of the Young Americans for Freedom, a conservative youth organization. Its founding statement emphasizes conservative ideas around limited government, a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and the defeat of communism and an emphasis on individual rights. Dixon versus Alabama, 1961. So Alabama State College summarily expelled a group of African-American students for participating in a civil rights demonstration. After they were refused service at a lunch grill located in the basement of the Montgomery County Courthouse. The college expelled the students without any notice, hearing, or opportunities for appeal. In other words, without respect for due process rights. The students challenged their expulsions and as a violation of their constitutional rights to due process, and the court actually ruled in favor. So this was a huge turning point for the concept of universities acting in what's called loco parentis, which was the first slide that we looked at in the timeline, where colleges had essentially parental rights over their student attendees. In 1962, students at Columbia University from an underground society called the Student Homophile League, they were not given funding, space, or recognition because they will not give the administration a list of names of the members of the groups in order to protect them. By the late 1960s, LGBTQ plus student groups have formed on a handful of college campuses, and by 1970, there were over 200 LGBTQ plus groups on campuses across the country. 1968, student organizers and other protesters converge on Chicago to protest the 1968 Democratic National Convention. The SDS, the Yippies, and groups opposing the Vietnam War all participate in a mass protest for all 8 days of the convention. Riots break out during various protest marches, and many students and protesters are arrested. Also in 1968, the Black Student Union at San Francisco State University drafts the Justification for African American Studies political statement. Black, API, Native, and Chicano students joined together to form the Third World Liberation Front. A 5-month student strike at San Francisco State University establishes the first division of ethnic studies and Department of Black, Asian, Chicano, and Native Studies. Hear a dog in the background there. 1968, students at campuses across the country get their institutions to boycott grapes as part of the United Farm Workers Boycott Campaign. At its height, more than 14 million Americans helped by not buying these grapes. In 1976, the anti-apartheid divestment campaign on campuses began on the West Coast in 1976 at Stanford University. Students organized to demand that their universities divest or cease investing in companies that traded or had operations in South Africa. The divestment movement had early successes in 1978 at Michigan State University, which voted total divestment, Ohio University, at Columbia University, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In 1979, founded by Morton C. Blackwell in 1979, the Leadership Institute identifies, recruits, trains, and places conservatives in the public policy process. Over the past 30 years, the Institute has trained more than 74,000 of America's brightest and young men and women for effective leadership in the public policy process. The Institute offers a number of educational programs, an intern program, an employment placement service, and a broadcast journalism placement service to train young conservatives and place them in the public policy positions. Jumping to 1997, student anti-sweatshop labor movements gain momentum, eventually encompassing more than 100 campuses across the country. Sparked by a sit-in at Duke University, students organized teach-ins, led demonstrations, and occupied buildings, first at Georgetown, then at Northeast to the Ivy League, then west to the Big Ten. Students demand that the workers who make these goods be paid a living wage no matter where in the world industry operates. Students also call for an end to discrimination against women workers, public disclosure of the names and addresses of all factories involved in production, and independent monitoring in order to verify compliance of factories licensed to produce garments bearing the university's logo. Then we jump ahead to 2015. Led by concerned students in 1950, Students at University of Missouri protest a series of racist incidents on campus and inaction by campus leadership. Students go on a hunger strike. University football players announce they won't play, possibly costing the university approximately $1 million. The protest results in the resignation of both the president and chancellor of Mizzou. Pretty powerful moment there. And then finally here, so in 2018, we have a lot on this slide. So feel free to take a little gander at that, but I'll try to contextualize it. So this is essentially a press release that came, or a document that was leaked from Turning Point USA. This organization has funders, including the DeVos Foundation and Bradley Foundation, and they're a fiscally conservative foundation, which focuses on like anti-worker union organizations, the Freedom Foundation. And these groups identify college campuses to build bases on. So as we can see on the left side here, there's a list of some of the college campuses that they wanted to work on and plant leadership in. And they plan to implement this with the defunding of SSAs and student perks, which in this state would be Oxford, block the BDS movement, and push more American exceptionalism and free market ideas. Okay, so that is the duration of the timeline we had here. Some of that was condensed because we wanted to give more time to the panel. However, I hope that this was a decent overview and we can send the extended timeline via email to all the participants. But I just wanted to have a moment for folks to throw in the comments or raise their hand on some of the observations that they noticed in the timeline. And feel free, if you want us to go back to a particular slide or year, we can definitely do that. But I think that this is a good time to just kind of debrief and talk about that timeline. Panelists also feel free to join in. I see Madeline's hand raised. Go for it.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of interesting to see kind of some of the ties we see between some of the historical items and then what's happening now. Like, I was thinking about kind of during the disinvestment piece. Currently, we're looking at ASPSU to get PSU kind of disinvested from fossil fuels. So we've been looking into creating resolutions around that, and kind of working on that, as well as I know OSU does a lot of work around trying to work on anti-sweatshop things and working with the university to kind of advocate for more sustainable fashion practices. And a lot of the design and fashion students are involved with that. So kind of cool to see kind of the trends that have stuck around and hopefully gotten stronger and pushed harder against administration. So.
Yeah, Madeline, thanks for highlighting that. And it's definitely an uphill battle, right? I think that in the time that I was at the University of Oregon, there was a lot of work prior to me starting there around anti-sweatshop labor movements. And obviously at the University of Oregon, there is a lot of corporate ties with folks like, Nike. And so there was actually a movement in this that we didn't cover in the timeline as well that talked about the Workers' Rights Consortium, which was meant to be a watchdog for sweatshop labor practices and provide accountability for universities if there was moments that they looked at that they were not practicing ethically, to divest from those companies and then require more ethically sourced companies. And unfortunately, with the power that Nike has, they were able to pretty much kill that bill the day of that they arrived in the Capitol. And so there was a lot of movement that sparked in response to that with the Alta Gracia campaigns that we were working on trying to get an ethically sourced with a factory that was unionized in the Dominican Republic in a free trade zone, which is actually pretty rare, with quality and ethically sourced apparel that's just as good, if not better, than Nike quality. And also more ethically sourced, but that work is still in collaboration. But yeah, I'm glad to hear that you noticed some of those trends. AFQ, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe kind of like reflect on like kind of pulling out some themes of the types of organizing, and also maybe like add in a little bit of some other stuff I think that's relevant for history of the student movement. So one thing is that and I think that we kind of saw a jump in organizing starting around the 40s and 50s is when things started. You know, before that, it was a little bit more stagnant. There's more of like forming the identity of like the student versus the university administration. I think there are good examples of that. Really in the late 40s after World War II with the GI Bill, there was an expansion of really who had access to higher education of colleges and universities. So you have what before was really just like wealthy white men who really were the only population that had access to higher education in large mass. You have more working class folks who are having access to higher education, more women, not that many at first, but there is definitely, from what it was before at that point, more women. And then also there's starting to be the establishment of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. And then really, I think in the from then on, you start to see there's more organizing when even just a small sliver of a population like starts to have access to the institutions or starts to feel like, why do others have access to this and we don't? Then there starts to be organizing. And so I think that one other one I really wanted to highlight was also the Chicano movement in Southern California during the 60s that really called attention to the fact that there was a huge Latinx population in California, and yet there's almost no folks from the Latinx community that had access to the public universities and colleges in the state of California. And there was this really vibrant movement that then actually, even though it was in California, spread and inspired policies and also organizing, like both policies and organizing across the country. And I think that a lot of like one line to kind of trace throughout the history of the student movement in the United States context is folks organizing for broader access of who actually has access to higher education in the United States and expanding that. Another like line I think to trace is I think a lot of the solidarity campaigns of students being at the forefront on a lot of different issues and movements in solidarity with workers, with undocumented folks, immigrants. I think the United Farm Worker movement that was highlighted in there is an example of that. The anti-apartheid movement in the 90s, there's a lot of organizing, a lot of solidarity movements of not necessarily classical, like what many would say, like issues directly on campus, but folks organizing to try and influence other things outside of just what's happening on the campus. And the last thing I would just highlight that's just really relevant for OSA is really the forming of student-run organizations. So students actually forming their own organizations that can be lasting institutions to advocate for student interests. And that really starts in somewhat in the 50s, but really becomes a big thing in the 60s and 70s with the establishment of statewide student associations all over the country, including OSA. And then also there's the National Student Association that goes through many chapters of its organization, but also gets, it starts in the late 40s, but gets really big in the 60s and 70s of students actually creating their own institutions to advocate on behalf of their own rights. So just some things I wanted to pull out of like some of the lines you can trace of different types of student organizing.
Yeah, thank you, Alexandra. That was a lot of really great observations. And I'm seeing there was a lot that came in the chat while you were talking too, some comments around solidarity and different communities coming together, which I think Alexandra did touch on and is definitely a really important component of the timeline. Sarahi mentioned that at UT Austin, they organized Alta Gracia at the student co-op and actually had a win during that fight. So if you want to share a little bit more about how that happened, definitely would love to hear that. And then Vicky Gim mentioned something about the timeline and the Harvard butter thing, and that wasn't covered. So if you also want to talk about that, then feel free to now.
Okay. I was just wondering about if the Harvard thing was covered. Hi everyone, I'm Vicky, she, her, hers. I go to Oregon State. I have some notes from a workshop that I adopted from like administrators at Oregon State, and how they said that the first documented case of student activism was in 1638 Harvard, and it was about cooking issues. And it was because the housemaster's wife cooking like sucked, and they wanted better butter, and they said, behold, our butter stinketh, give us therefore butter that stinketh not. And I think it's really interesting to think about how people have framed like student activism as something that's very attached to like social issues around race and inequality, as if like student activists have just exclusively been a bunch of hippies throughout history or something that were like students of color and like, you know, angry liberals or whatever. But you know, like there have also been like the start of student activism supposedly that was documented was a bunch of entitled white boys who just wanted to complain about butter. So I don't know, I just was curious.
Yeah, no. Thank you for covering that. I think that's something that the timeline doesn't really get on, but it is important to talk about the ways that sometimes movements get co-opted or watered down. When, especially because I think you mentioned that was pulled from administration at OSU, and I think I've seen that with other administrations at other colleges, where a lot of times they try to prepackage or change the history in a format that makes sense for the operations of, you know, the institution as an institution, and not highlighting some of the things that were counterproductive for the institution but necessary for progress. So I think that's a really important highlight. Sarahi, I see your hand raised.
Okay, yeah, I can share a little bit about the Alta Gracia campaign. So I think it took about like 2 years. And I mean, it was like the typical, you know, like we did a letter delivery and then like had to like escalate it, of course, because UT is awful. And at the time, I don't know if it still is, it's like the largest producer of like collegiate apparel, or it was at the time. And so yeah, it was like really tough. And like, I mean, we were only able to get like a portion of the co-op clothing to come from Alta Gracia, but it was like still a victory, you know. But UT ended up monopolizing all of the collegiate apparel, and had a contract with Nike. So like Nike was in charge of everything, which was like a really big issue. But I mean, I graduated by the time like that happened. But I mean, it's possible, you know, it's just like some really hard work, and we had like connections with like the union down there. But yeah, it was hard, but totally possible, you know.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that. All right, great. Well, any other like highlights, questions, observations around the timeline, or just different moments of student organizing that people want to focus on before we get into our panelist introductions? All right, great. Well, I don't hear any, and I haven't seen any else come up in the chat. So we will get right into introductions. So the first person that we want to introduce is Lucero, Margarita, Castañeda, Bugarin. Would you like to introduce yourself a bit more?
My mic's on, right?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Hey, everyone. I'm so glad to be here sharing some time and space with you all. Thank you so much for inviting us to collaborate with you. So I started at the University of Oregon in 2009, and I graduated in 2014. I did my bachelor's in ethnic studies was my primary, and then I had the swirl of nonprofit management, city planning, public policy, which if I could go back, I probably wouldn't do again. And I focused a lot of my work with Mecha, was primarily the focus of my organizing. I did dive into some other areas. And let's see, I'm the youngest of 8 children. And so I was fortunate enough to have my brothers and sisters guide me through the process of applying for college, getting some grants and scholarships, and really maximizing our potential into higher education and being able to get our degree. So I'm really grateful for that. And having resources like OSA was awesome and wonderful. And I actually got involved in student organizing because of my brother, Jairo, who had gone to the U of O a year before me. And it was so interesting for me to actually go to the school where he was at, because he had been there already 1 year. And when he would come back home and visit, he really never told us about the work that he was doing. And so when I went back with him to the U of O, I was like, wow, you're doing all sorts of great things. Why didn't you tell us? And I got involved in MECHA and OSA and OSAC because of him. So definitely, if I wouldn't have had that role model, maybe I wouldn't have gotten as involved. And so I'm really grateful for that. I think that's everything for now.
All right, great. Thanks, Lucero. For the next panelist introduction, Andreina Granado. Would you like to introduce yourself a bit more?
Hi, I'm Andreina. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm from Venezuela originally. I grew up in Miami, Florida. I went to school at Florida State, so Florida State. I studied history and women's studies, but originally, you know, just like a lot of folks, I was poli-sci. I thought I was gonna go to law school. I had all these, you know, very typical plans, and then you get to college and you learn what it is, and you learn what things are. And I switched when I got involved with a lot of like student organizing. You know, I was part of student government, just like, you know, a lot of people, but I also was involved with, you know, Dream Defenders, and I was involved with, you know, SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, like the reboot, the new version, because I know you talked about like the 60s one in your presentation. And I mean, I think it, you know, now that I think about it, I'm like, it's been almost 10 years since I, you know, I graduated high school and I was in college, but it was just such a crucial time in terms of like, you know, the culture shifting. And I always think of like, you know, Occupy happened in 2011. And that was like a really big thing in terms of like the way I saw like myself, the way I saw, you know, the 99% and like the working class. You know, there was a lot of people, you know, were dying in our communities, you know, Trayvon, like Mike Brown. And I, you know, just got involved in the movement, and I've been involved ever since, and I'm still organizing.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. Perla Alvarez Lucio, you're up next.
Hola everyone. Hi, my name is Perla Alvarez and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I went to the University of Oregon and graduated in 2017. That is correct. With a Bachelor's of Arts in Ethnic Studies. Love ethnic studies forever and ever. I knew that I wanted to study ethnic studies because I met one of our professors at one of the conference that I went to right before going into the University of Oregon, Professor Hoseng, who's no longer there. But I went to one of his workshops at this conference with the Western State Center, and I was mind blown. I was like, I want to continue learning about this. I forgot what the workshop was about, but it blew my mind, and I was like, how can I get into your courses once I go to the U of O? And he gave me his contact information, and then he made sure that I registered as an ethnic studies major. And if you are a student of ethnic studies, you know that they teach you things like the timeline for the student movement, and a lot of other things that really kind of expand your knowledge on different areas, such as like law, literature, history. So it's a pretty cool area of studies, and I encourage you all to take ethnic studies courses if you have them in your university or in your college. And if you will transfer to a university, if you go to a community college right now, see if your university also has an ethnic studies major. I don't know. And I mentioned ethnic studies because, again, I'm really passionate about it, and I was involved in like the ethnic studies K through 12 campaign in Oregon while I was a student, and also after college, and it is something that I deeply believe in, and that I think is an area of studies that will allow our future generations to continue organizing and continue fighting for what's best for the community, because you learn what your ancestors did, for us to be able to get an education and for us to be here sharing space and knowledge together. I now work with the census, making sure that we have an accurate and equitable census count. And that is just a little bit about me. You'll learn more through the panel.
All right, great. Thank you. And Alexandra Flores-Quilty, you're up.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alexandra, or most folks in OSA or U of O always call me by my initials, AFQ, so feel free to call me AFQ. And the pronouns I use are she and her. I got started in student organizing when I was a student at the University of Oregon. Wow, that almost 10 years ago. This week was my birthday. I just turned 28. So I was like, wow, that was 10 years ago. Oh my goodness. And yeah, I wasn't really political, wasn't a political science major, didn't really see a future in that for myself, mostly because I just didn't have a lot of confidence, didn't think that even if I had some political beliefs, or I didn't like how things worked in the world or the ways things had affected my family. My kind of understanding was that, these bigger things are in place, and you just try and figure out how to like survive and navigate society and do what you can to succeed. But that there's not a lot you can do about just kind of about survival. And really quickly, I was, there's such a vibrant culture and presence of student organizing that was on my campus. And I was really quickly, recruited to come to over and over again. People kept on trying to approach me with a clipboard on campus, which I would avoid at all costs. And eventually, someone named Lamar Weiss, who many of you know, who's an alumni of OSA, both as a student and as a staff member. Lamar was a friend of mine and told me to come to a meeting. And because he had to bring a friend, that was the requirement. He's couldn't come to the meeting unless he brought 2 friends with him. So I was one of them. And yeah, I think it really resonate with what Perla has said about one of the examples that they talked about in that meeting that for me was kind of a turning point about feeling connected to a larger history of student organizing, and actually everyday students that were just like me who actually organized to change how things worked. Was that at that meeting they talked about the ethnic studies department that exists at the University of Oregon, and how it wasn't just magically there. Students actually organized for years a campaign at the University of Oregon to actually form the ethnic studies department. It was, students of color who were we want to learn about our histories. We've never been had access to learn about our histories, and this is a institution of education. We should have access to that here. And and they were just following it. This was in the 90s and early 2000s. They were actually also following the lineage of other students that we learned about in that timeline, who began organizing and forcing universities to start ethnic studies departments all the way back into the 60s. And so the reason why I could learn about when I took an ethnic studies course, I was wow, I'm tracing my own family's history about when my family immigrated from Mexico to the US. This is the first time I can place the context of my family's history into the larger context of what was actually happening in our country and the world. And the reason why I have access to that, I actually owe it to those who came before me. And so if that's what they did, what am I going to do now? And so that was kind of a turning point for me. And not to be dramatic, but it kind of changed my life because I became a student organizer and was involved with the Oregon Student Association. I sat on the Oregon Students of Color Coalition Board, was involved, in student government, was a part of a lot of on-campus organizing, which I'll share some of those anecdotes later, and then also very quickly became a part of the United States Student Association, USSA, and doing organizing with other students across the country. And unfortunately, at the end of my 4 years of school, I actually was forced to drop out because I couldn't afford to stay in school any longer. So I actually didn't graduate college. I went to school for 4 years, but I don't have a college degree. And coming from a working class family who, the FAFSA and the the student loan system and stuff really did not work for us. And we had to go through so many hoops and in so many different ways. It was really, really challenging, not only for me, but my whole family. And I think what really kind of kept me going was actually getting to feel some agency through student organizing, to actually literally organize with other students who are being affected by how our education system does not work, to try and change it. And actually we were successful in so many different ways in changing it, not only at the statewide level, but also the national level. And so when I dropped out of school, I then ran for office with the United States Student Association to become vice president and then president, and got to live in DC for a couple of years, worked full time, supporting and organizing with students all across the country to try and change our education system. And then since then, I've really, after my term at USSA, I've been really anchored within a lot of different larger US movements and understanding what makes movements win, what can we learn from our losses, different types of organizing, which I can share more about later, but been doing a lot of national work, and I'm currently based in New York, but spent most of my life in Oregon. So I call Oregon home, and I'll share more later.
All right, great. Thank you all so much for your introductions, and we're so excited to have you here. So now we're in the Q&A portion. And this is the opportunity for you all as students to really have the opportunity to talk to former organizers in the student movement and current organizers now, to get some advice, to have some conversations around some of the issues that maybe you've been navigating on your campuses, and kind of see what was the work that was done in the past and what are some things that maybe you can pull from to get some thoughts about now. And so we have a pretty large amount of time for question and answers. It's 4:43 right now, and we have it earmarked until 5:30. So feel free to raise your hand if questions start to percolate for you, or throw them in the chat. And one of the questions that I've been seeing from Madeline that came up while introductions were happening is how to do remote organizing. And so the question of we're during a COVID time right now, and a lot of the usual organizing tactics that we utilize relies on a lot of in-person organizing, the clipboarding that I heard people mention and things like that. And so with the work that you all as panelists have done, maybe more recently during COVID or in the past, what have been some of the responses to try to have effective digital organizing tactics? And then panelists, feel free to just raise your hand as responses come up, and then we'll get to you all.
I really want to hear more about Andreina.
Okay, so I guess just in reference to the question, which was organizing in terms of in the time of COVID. So this week we had so just for context, I work at UCLA, I work at the university with the UC system. So this week, the regents, the board of trustees had a meeting. They were meeting online. So we had people who called in and participated, and shared their opinions. But while they were having their meeting, we hit up different board members across the state. We went to their homes, and we held, we basically had a drive-by action. We had a car caravan. So everybody put signs on their cars, and we just honked around their houses or around their block, you know, while they're having this meeting, as a way to like disrupt, another way of, you know, like I said, we were still social distancing. Everybody was still in their cars, but we had like the visual aspect of like the banners with the signs. And we were able to like, you know, disrupt and get a point across, like a targeted action across the state at all the different like board members' houses. So there's, you know, different ways where you can get creative, you can, you know, still organize. You know, we organize with, obviously with our workers, but with students in conjunction, because we know that in times of COVID, like on our campuses, there are making a lot of cuts that affect like, you know, workers, that affect like student workers. And, you know, while they're making these decisions and, you know, they're taking their 10% pay cuts, they're not thinking of like, you know, how the people at the bottom are actually affected.
Thank you so much for that, Andreina. That's really awesome and creative. Any other panelists have some things that they want to highlight around remote organizing or COVID organizing?
Well, right now I've been working a lot with or like culturally based organizations through my work, and I get to hear about the things that they're doing. So as my work right now with the census, you know, we had a whole plan to do it before, you know, we didn't know COVID was going to happen. So we had a whole plan to do like, you know, phone banking, door-to-door knocking, in-person events, just to get people excited on the census. And this would also be an opportunity for the organizations that are part of the census efforts to expand their base so that they can invite more people, you know, to their events, their actions, and stuff like that. But post-COVID, everyone had to adjust, of course, and then events such as rallies had to go and now turn into digital organizing. So I can speak on, you know, the Latinx community, because that's the community that I, you know the most, and the organizations that I'm really close with right now. But I feel like Facebook is really working, especially with like the other community and the Latinx community. So I think organizing education sessions where you can teach people on a topic on using like social media platforms such as Facebook has been a really effective way to do it right now while social distancing, and especially right now that a lot of people have a lot of time in their hands. It's a great way to start doing kind of like events like this, right? And I see organizing in 3 sections type of thing, and that there is the education part that is hopefully, you know, agitating people. So you are teaching people parts of history, right? The parts of history that are not right, to get people mad and agitated. So that's the second part. And once people are angry on the things that is not right, then you can move them into action. So I think in that action piece between like the education and moving people into action, people can be creative. And I really like that idea, you know, that Andreina shared, because that's just one example of being creative in these new times of, you know, social distancing. So I invite you all to use your creativity if you want to organize an action with your peers.
All right, thanks, Perla. And AFQ, I see your hand raised.
Yeah. So I think that I really love frameworks, and I like the one that Perla just like laid out. I feel like frameworks are really helpful to kind of help organize and think strategically. I think the one thing that from Andreina's example that I think is like a good way of, is kind of like a good foundational point, is that like, if you're doing organizing or a campaign that's targeting a decision maker to try and win some specific instrumental change, right now, because of these times, they are also having to adapt how they like run day-to-day business, right? They're like also transitioning to often online meeting spaces or what have you. And so I think that, you know, tracking your decision makers and figuring out like, how are they actually operating under these times? How are their timelines like for when they're making decisions about things that are affecting you all. How is that changing? And doing your research, like using the different tools you have to track those changes, and then figure out what are points of pressure or what are points of disruption that we can add to that. And I think that, as Perla said, like, it's a very, like, I think now is the time to be creative. Like, these are unprecedented times in so many different ways. And so that there's a huge opportunity here for innovation. We also have, like, you know, every year we have access to new technology that we never had access to before. Like, technology evolves, people's, what's the term, like, digital competency, like, also evolves. One of the campaigns I was a part of organized cross-generation for the last couple of years around Trump's impeachment. And we had a lot of older folks who were in their 60s, sometimes 70s or 80s. And many folks were like, you know, they're never going to learn how to use Zoom. Like, it's really out of their wheelhouse. And we definitely had some of those experiences. And also more and more into the campaign, we had people who came to us like, oh, I know how to use Zoom. And they're like an 80-year-old granny. And I was like, how do you know how to use Zoom? And they're like, oh, I like learned it from this other campaign I volunteer with. And so, like, people are like learning these skills more and more. And so more things become possible. One of the frameworks I wanted to offer is that, like, right, you have like your strategy and you have a goal and a strategy for like, how are you going to win that goal? Like, what's your planned path to victory? And then your tactics are what get you there along the way. I just want to offer maybe like a framework to think about different types of tactics in 4 categories. The first is symbolic. Like, so for one example, right now during COVID, there's been a lot of things in like honoring those who have died because of the pandemic. And so, you know, the reading of the names of those who have passed away. There's been folks who organize demonstrations with projectors that go onto major buildings and big public spaces that say the names. These are symbolic actions that are kind of creating a shared sense of mourning, that are bringing attention to like what's actually at stake right now. It's not necessarily like always directly targeted at the decision maker, but it helps build momentum, and a shared kind of changes the conversation. So that's like symbolic, like that's category number 1. Number 2 is targeting the decision makers. So I think that the example earlier for the folks in UC of actually, you know, doing demonstrations, folks getting in their car, disrupting, really having that like encounter with the decision makers to be like in their face. The third is like, there's a lot of direct service, I think, happening right now of helping folks get access to things that they need. And that's actually also a good form of base building, right? So people, if they're getting access to things they need, they actually are now becoming part of your community. And you can also have the opportunity to do the 4th thing, which is what I think Perla had mentioned, which is political education. There's also an opportunity right now to politicize people on different platforms, you know, have teach-ins like this one, or it can be specific to a particular campaign about an issue, politicize them. And I think that the most important thing that within that category is what Perla said, which is that like, once they get like politicized, that's the time to agitate them, to then move them into action of some sort. So just some things of like within those categories, there's a whole plethora of tactics that are at your disposal, but those tactics should be in service of a strategy and of a larger goal.
All right, perfect. Thank you all so much for those. That's been really insightful. So we're gonna move on with another question that's came from, Lucero, do you have a response?
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, really quickly. I think that all of you mentioned great key points, and right now that AFQ was sharing about like different actions that are visible, I remembered like all the banner drops, and either from buildings or from bridges, even though people aren't really out in public spaces, like people are, and people are still doing different things. They have to go to grocery stores and get things, and so you go outside, you still see people out and about. And so finding centralized locations where you can do large symbolic things that even if someone's driving, you get their attention, and there's a way for them to learn about what's going on and how to get involved. And I think that's great. And with all of the I want to say physical distancing, because I almost want to say that even though we can't be in the same space together, we're almost connected a lot more, because we can have 20 people right here in my house, and we don't leave a mess after, right? And so I think that it's actually a great moment to bring people together. And, you know, right now I live close to Los Angeles. I'm in Los Angeles County, and most of my friends and family are in Oregon. And so before, I would rarely talk to them, maybe on the phone. Even calling someone on the phone is like sometimes awkward. It's like, why are you calling me? Can you just send me a text or an email? And now we're like staring at each other's faces all the time. And so I feel like it's a great moment to connect with folks that maybe before it's like, oh, you live in another state, you're not going to be able to connect with my struggle or my campaign that I'm working on with right now, and I'm having this event, but you don't even live here and I can't invite you. And I feel like we should use that to, you know, connect to people all across the country, the world. You know, AFQ is on the East Coast, we're on the West Coast, and we're still in the same space, in the same time. And I think it's a great opportunity to just connect with people a lot more. And it's a lot faster. You know, you don't have to drive to and from different meetings and the campus visits. You don't spend hours and hours going to each different campus. It's like right there in the moment. It's a lot more accessible, a lot faster, easier to connect. And I feel like it's a great moment to really be able to connect with people at a deeper level and understand each other a little bit better.
Thank you for that. All right, so I had a question come up from somebody whose call dropped, so I wanted to get to theirs. Adriana from LCC, she had a question around base building. And so her question is what do you do when you notice that there's less active members, specifically for her in Mecha right now? What are ways to be doing base building and get more people involved other than things like flyers and social media, etc.?
That's a tricky one, because I think that the most focused way that we get people involved for the very first time is that face-to-face interaction when you're in passing from classes, when people are in common areas eating lunch or whatnot, in workplaces, in class. And so I think that right now it makes it a little bit more difficult, because if we don't know who these folks are, it's harder to make that first time introduction and impression. And so I think that we need to revisit a little bit past friendships and past folks that maybe we did have in class. And it's like, oh yeah, I remember I was in this class with this person. I need to follow up and reconnect. And I haven't talked to this person in 2 years, but they still go to my school. I saw them register in the same class as me, and really being able to reconnect with people and just check in on folks. Maybe they were involved, something happened, they came to 1 or 2 meetings, and then they dropped off the map. But just simply like a call, a text, whatever form of communication, just checking in on them, like, hey, how are you doing? How are you handling the situation right now with the virus? And really showing people that you care. You know, it's not just a signature the night in a petition. It's not just another spot on, you know, the bus that we're taking to the Capitol to be filled. Like, I'm actually interested in you and your contributions and you as a person, because the things that you're going to be able to offer and contribute, no one else can. And making that person feel special, right? And figuring out a game plan to move on. Like, okay, we get them interested. What's next? Have a stepping stone to be able to build upon.
Thank you. And I had Andreina raise her hand next.
Just like expanding on that, I think it goes back to like being like intentional with people. I think like, you know, the flyers and the, you know, emails, or, you know, a lot of these things are like very like passive tactics. And, you know, I think this is like, you know, I think if you're really trying to build your base, you really want to be like intentional with people. You want to go back to like the one-on-ones. You want to go back to like having those like, you know, deeper conversations with folks. And I know it's like, you're probably thinking, okay, this is going to be time consuming, but it is time consuming, and it does take a little bit of effort to like connect with the people you are trying to like target. So if you have a list, like I would start phone banking. I would start just trying to have like Zoom, you know, like kind of like set up the Zoom one-on-ones So you can really, you know, get to know these people and make, like, if they're like old members and they fell off or whatever it is. But I think you're gonna have to put in that like that effort to build your base through like having connections, having like relationships, and making, you know, people like, you know, see what you're like, you know, what you're bringing to the table, like why should they get involved. And I think that, like I said, it can't just be like a lot of the things we're doing right now, like in terms of like, you know, social media can be really passive. So it's just like, that's good for visibility, but you have to like move beyond that.
All right, thank you. And I saw Perla raise your hand next.
Yeah, thank you. I also agree the one-on-ones really work well, but I feel like another thing that that could help is like spreading the word about your group, right? A lot of people might not be involved in MECHA right now because they don't know that there's even a MECHA, right, at LCC. So I think if you have professors who know what MECHA is, you can connect with the professors or with the faculty and ask them that you're, you know, looking for members to join MECHA, and if they can help you make announcements of when you are gathering with people, and ask them to share your email so that they can reach out to you and to you directly, and you can set up that one-on-one. So using your connections that you have with like faculty and staff so that they can spread the word, and like people can learn about MECHA or your group through them. I think that's one of the ways in which I would go about it. And if, you know, the professor doesn't have time to explain what MECHA is, you know, you can give them a quick explanation of what that is. So that is just one of the ways in which I would announce that there's this opportunity to gather people.
Perfect. And AFQ?
Yeah, I think those are so many great insights. I think a couple other offerings. One, I think just making things fun, like we all want to be a part of things that are actually just like fun. And when it starts to like not feel that way, then like people don't want to join or people don't want to stay. And so if things start to feel stagnant, of like, what's something that like you would like literally you would actually enjoy organizing, attending, being a part of. And like, if you don't want to like go to it or be a part of it, then like, why would anyone else want to? I think the other thing is also like, to maybe simplify, I would say like either A, make it fun, or B, make it matter. So also just like calling people into like the stakes, if there's urgency, like, hey, like, you know, we have like a big campaign there, you know, the state legislature is going to be voting in 3 weeks. Like, now's the window for us to like really go ham so we can have an influence on this decision. Like, I need you right now. Can you be a part of this? So like making it matter, and that there's like actually a time bound thing to it. Also, people like, I feel like, are, if they like know of like there's an ask of like, can you help throw down for the next 3 weeks? They're like, oh, okay, 3 weeks. And they might continue on after that, but just like kind of giving a time bound thing, because if people are like, can you help be a part of this forever? Like, that like seems like maybe a little bit intimidating. And then I would also just say, one of the things I really learned from OSA was that like, you know, give people a role, give them roles and responsibilities that are actually meaningful. Like trust in them, and people will actually feel really, a lot of times will feel really honored and special, and like wow, like they trusted me to like run this phone bank. Like they trusted me to like be the one in charge of like follow-up calls. One that also distributes the workload, so you don't have to do everything yourself. And then two, like if people have a role of like, oh, like I'm the one who's going to be signing people in, I have to like, one, not miss this meeting, and two, I can't be late because they actually have like a specific reason or purpose to be there. And then the last thing I would just share, for this is more about not necessarily new folks, but like retention, is that like we have all had the experience where like we feel really bad because we like kind of dipped out on something. Like we like hadn't been to a meeting in a while, we've kind of been MIA, and we kind of feel guilty about it. And one of my old mentors used to call it like the shame cycle, and it just gets like worse and worse because like you felt a little bit guilty at one point, and then now you just keep on avoiding, but it's just making you feel more and more guilty for not being present. And so I think that if you're on the other end of that, of just like having empathy of like, we've all been there in some sort of manner, and like how, like what would work on you to try and invite you back in, like guilt-free. Like, we just want you here, actually. Like, it's fine. Like that you've been like, you know, like pieced out for the last 2 months or whatever. We just want you back, and like you can come back and it's like guilt-free, and we'll be so excited for you to be here again. Like, what are the ways that you can approach or reach out to them that can kind of signify that, so that they don't feel all this like stress of like, I want to come back, but like everyone's gonna be mad at me because I haven't been to a meeting in 2 months or whatever. And so I just think having some empathy and think about like, if you were in their shoes, what would potentially be the thing that you could say or how you could approach it that will be inviting that to that for them to like come back into the group.
Lucero, did you have something else you wanted to add?
Yeah, really quickly. Also, reevaluating and reflecting on, for right now, the example is Mecha, right? So when I was in Mecha, I noticed that there was a lot of tension, and this happens with a lot of different organizations, right? With like the leadership and, oh, I'm just a member. And people would say that all the time, oh, I'm just a member. And I would always tell them like, it's not just a member, you know, you're a contributing person that has something to offer all the time. And I think that making that distinction isn't very healthy, and have Q said, giving everyone a role. And so every person, regardless if it's their first time there or they've been there 100 times, should have some way to contribute and to be able to give feedback, and also reflect on the retention part. Like, okay, are we being welcoming when it comes to events? Who are we inviting? And are we letting people know, like right now, for example, I'm sure that you all have certain members that you invited and aren't here today, right? And so follow up with them. Be like, hey, I noticed that you weren't able to make it. Like, is everything okay? Was the link not working? Were you struggling with something? Make sure that they notice that you noticed that they weren't here, right? That they were missed, that something wasn't here, right? And so I think that's very important, and they feel more valued, like Perla was saying.
Perfect. Thank you all so much. I love the highlights of people-led organizing, and think that's really important. I saw Vicky in the comments mention that that she works in student affairs and college administration, and some of the things that she mentions is involvement means money, class credit, and stuff to put on their resumes. I think that's also something that I'm glad you highlighted, Vicky, that we obviously want to help promote social mobility within our communities as well. So if panelists have any ideas about like promotion of social mobility within your communities, then feel free to highlight any of that. And any other questions that people have, feel free to start throwing in the chat or raise your hands for. And if nobody throws in another question soon, I can put in one of my questions. Okay, so Nikio wants some highlights around Vicky's previous question, which
I can.
Oh no, go ahead. Go for it.
Yeah, I think that, so I think that something that comes to, I also appreciate Vicky being like, it's kind of a capitalist way to think about it, but that's also our system. You know, I think that there's other reasons why, especially when it comes to like organizing, of why people feel motivated or called to things, and makes sense that like in administration would be like, oh, like these students just want like money and class credit and like whatever. But also I do think that one thing I would highlight for this that comes up for me is that the work that we do actually is really meaningful and impressive, and that helping yourself and helping one another talk about the work and actually how what a big deal it is. Like, you know, the roles that you hold, if you're a campaign manager or you're the coordinator for your Metro chapter, or what, like, there's actually a lot of stuff that goes into that. And you are like owning a level of responsibility. You are actually sharpening your skills in really incredible ways that will serve you for the rest of your life. And learning how to actually talk about that and own that. And I think especially for a lot of like marginalized identities, for women, femmes, like working class folks, folks of color, often feel imposter syndrome of like, I have no experience, like, I don't know what to put my resume, I've never really done anything. And actually, you've probably done a lot. And folks with more privileged identities probably feel very confident talking about all the great things that they've done, of like, yeah, I'm incredibly competent. Like, I once did this like one thing, and you're like, oh, I actually organized and was in charge of this entire group and actually won this incredible campaign, or what have you. Just like figuring out actually how to talk about our work, to like own that, to own our experiences and our skill sets. And I think that one thing with that, like, titles sometimes can matter, like, or like be helpful. One way is like, you know, for some of your groups, like, you can just create titles, like, you don't have to ask permission from anyone. And I think that the titles can be helpful to, one, visibilize the labor that's already happening and like give it credit and authority of like, and you can make up whatever the heck you want, like of like, you know, master of snacks, or like snack goddess, and or like, you know, whatever it may be, just to like honor that like labor and work that's being done, and to like name it and visibilize it. I've been a part of like starting a number of organizations at this point, and we always gave ourselves like director level titles for many of the starting crew, like founders and stuff, because we knew when we interacted in coalition spaces, other organizations, they respond to like when someone has director behind their title, it's like, great, you're now the director of organizing. And like, we are like, it's also like not like an inflation, it's like actually the work that we're doing, and we should feel like entitled to like step in to like own our skill sets, own our experiences, own the work that we're doing. And I think that that can be also a good practice to like do as a group, to support each other and to like, let's like actually break this down. There's probably actually a lot of things that you're owning right now that are actually a big deal, and you should like feel like you should feel confident in that, and also to like be seen by others in your group and outside of your group in that work. So that's one thing that comes to mind for me.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. I really, really loved that. Perla, do you have your hand raised for this question? Oh, okay, okay. So one question that Vicky asked a little while ago, that Nick also brought attention back to, is the question around like culture shifts in organizing. And so I think that that's also a good question to ask. So the question is have you all seen a shift in the culture of activism at various institutions, particularly in the last 4 years? And if you have noticed, would you have any guesses as to why those shifts have been happening? Andreina?
I guess, I mean, I started working in higher ed like October of 2016. So like close to 4 years now. Just working, you know, I was working in New York. You know, I've worked in Oregon, I've worked now in California. I mean, I think there has been more, I mean, compared to when I was a student, I guess like there's been, like when we saw on the timeline, there's been like activism, you know, throughout like the history. I think that the last 4 years, there definitely has been, you know, different movements. I think we've seen a lot of issues. I think a lot of things have just come to the forefront. I think students have like felt connected to more struggles. I think, you know, students on their campuses, like, you know, like I said, when I was a student, like I was involved with Dream Defenders. You know, I always think of like a lot of like the systemic, you know, racism. We've seen a lot of people like, you know, die, like Black Lives Matter. Just like, I guess like there has been a lot of activism. I guess like the last 4 years, people have definitely organized, like, you know, since, you know, Trump, since, you know, these things, a lot of like different groups have been under attack. So I just feel like it creates, you know, more activism on our campuses. At least that's like my guess for like specifically in like relation to the last 4 years, just because like there have been you know, I guess a lot of different groups, like, you know, have been like, you know, more under attack. And I think as like students on their campuses, like they are not just seeing themselves as students, but they're seeing themselves as like community members connected to these like greater struggles. But even as like students, I feel like some student orgs like have been under attack. Like some students have seen like the departments like be under attack and like levels of funding. So I think people have like, you know, wanted to like shake things up. And I think it, you know, I think it comes back to like the more conservative culture we're living in right now.
All right, great, thanks. AFQ?
Yeah, I have trouble talking about it in the perspective of 4 years. I think also just because I haven't, from the organizing I was doing before as a student and then at USSA, it's been a couple of years now. So I'm less in tune with specifically the last 4 years, but I would say that there are, I think, some really major shifts in the last 10 years that I can name. And there's definitely an argument to even trace that back longer. So I think I actually want to call on a framework from Martin Luther King that talks about two different types of organizing social change. And what the way that he distinguished of like one way to think about it is the idea between long-term unit of power versus dramatic crisis. And this was something that was very present in their strategy during the civil rights movement and with the organization that Martin Luther King Jr. primarily organized with which was the Southern Leadership Conference. And so long-term unit of power is actually building institutions or having institutions that you're actually doing your organizing through. So OSA is an example of this, which is an institution led by students, funded by students, that's existed for decades, right? OSA has been building power for decades, and because of the students that have come before us, we're actually benefiting from like all this stuff. Like this house is already built, and we get to like operate in this house, or maybe it's a boat. Maybe a boat's a better metaphor. We get to like swim around in this sail around. I suck at metaphors. Sail around in this boat that's already been built. We don't have to build the boat. The other thing is, the other framework is dramatic crisis. So how do you take something that may not be like visible or at the front of the conversation, but make it into like the number one thing that people are talking about? And I really resonate with what Andreina has been saying about like, there's been a surge of this, like things are coming to the forefront. Like, you know, when we think about movement for Black lives, Michael Brown was not the first unarmed Black man that was murdered by the police, or Trayvon Martin even. Like that has been consistent of the murder by the state of Black folks and folks of color. But the difference is that what we saw that happened really in 2014 is what many of us would now call as, Black Lives Matter, a movement for Black lives, because it forced the United States and really the world to reckon with the brutality against Black life. And that was, after Michael Brown was murdered, that wasn't necessarily on all the major news stations across the country or across the world, but because of the Ferguson uprising, folks organizing in the community, doing this kind of spontaneous, in some ways, demonstration of people coming together, occupying space, that then forced the entire world actually to reckon with the murder of Michael Brown, and that we all know his name. And that, and there were so many demonstrations that kind of built off of each other after that. I was actually at USSA when, in 2014, when Movement for Black Lives really started to pop off and really became a thing that people talked about in that kind of way. And so tracking to the last 10 years, I would say that one, we have less of the long-term units of power across the country for students. Right, we named this before. Statewide student associations have been dismantled in basically every state in the United States. OSA is one of the last standing. They've been dismantled by university administrations, by state governments, and even the national government. And there's been laws that basically make it illegal for students to use their student fees to start their own organizations, state by state. That's been actually in the works for decades, but really in the last 10 years, that's been dismantled. So OSA is one of the last standing, and that's amazing. And also, I think my agitation to you all is that, like, you all are a powerhouse, and like, keep this. Like, it's, the torch has been passed to you all. but the long-term unit of power, like those same pipelines, there's all these students and young people and not young people who otherwise could have been politicized and been organizing stuff in their states that were never, found on their campus or, clipboarded or invited to that meeting, that never had that politicizing moment that so many of us have talked about, because there wasn't that presence of organizing that existed on their campus. And so that's one thing that's really changed in the landscape of the US, I would say, in the last 10 years. The other thing is that I remember when I first started doing student organizing 10 years ago, I remember people actually kind of debating and pushing back of is there actually a movement? People throw this around of oh yeah, the movement, we're part of the movement. And they're like, what movement? When's the last time in which there was major mobilization of any sort? What movement are people talking about? Most folks would not probably have that debate per se now, because we've regularly seen mass mobilization, which often feels spontaneous, happening on so many different issues, be it climate change, movement for Black lives, Occupy. I think Occupy was a big, people hadn't seen anything like that happen in decades in the US. In a lot of ways, the immigrant rights movement, there's just been a culture that people have developed, I think, a muscle on college campuses and all across the country to actually mobilize in different ways. And that's in the tradition and vein, I think, that, what Martin Luther King kind of labeled as the dramatic crisis of how do you bring stuff that's suffering or a crisis that's invisible or at on the back burner for public discourse, actually at the forefront of the discussion. And so I think that there has been major shifts, and that we actually have a very strong culture on that end, but we've had a huge attack on our institutions to actually be that anchoring foundation that can actually really develop skills, develop leaders, and have really strategic campaigns. And luckily for Oregon, we have OSA still going strong.
Thank you so much for that response, AFQ. I think that was a lot of great content. So we're running pretty short on time, and there is a few questions that have been coming up. So I'm going to try to limit it to maybe 1 or 2 responses per question from each panelist to each question. And hopefully we'll be able to crank out 1 or 2 more. And then at the end, we do have a few call to actions that OSA does have for all of the at-large attendees as well. So Jacob, I see you have your hand raised. Do you have a question?
I do have a question. So I was looking in the chat, and Vicky brought up that a lot of students are feeling really, I think, not the sense of urgency because of what happened in 2016. And so for the panelists or who folks have an opinion on this, what are ways that organizers can specifically combat some of the futility that students have felt from the 2016, and what are ways to re-engage and what that looks like?
Thank you for that question. Lucero?
Yeah, so I also noticed when Vicky and Nick mentioned that state, right? And I feel like one of the biggest things that I noticed both as a student and now after I graduated is this massive disconnect between our bubble on our college campus or university and the outside world, and how student issues are student issues, and the Pell Grant and the Oregon Opportunity Grant and tuition equity and the DREAM Act. And so there's issues that are very focused on the student body, and if you're not a student attending a post-secondary institution, it's irrelevant to you, right? And then there's other issues that are more societal, focused on race and inequality and poverty, that are happening all over, right? And so I think that it's difficult to say in the last 4 years, what trends have you noticed? Because every campus is going to be different. Every state is going to be different. Depending on what issue or campaign you were working on, it's going to be different. And so I think one of the biggest issues is that disconnect, that everybody has their own campaign, their own issue, their own identity, and they organize in that small realm. And we're not building intersections where we can build together and move a solid front all together, right? And so there's a joke that, the area of, us with the fist and power to the people, and we're all solidarity together. But really, we're like an open hand, and every finger is a separate issue, and we're all separating, organizing separately, when really the leftists are the ones with the solid fist working together and have a solid agenda. And I think that we don't talk to each other enough. We don't strategize with each other enough. Even in Oregon, there's events happening at the same time, and we don't talk to each other about that. We don't coordinate. And it's like, I do me, you do you, and that doesn't work. That doesn't work. And I feel like there needs to be more connect where we're building with the community as students, and we're using the institution, whether we like it or not, and use it to our benefit, right? What can we pull out of the institution of higher education to serve the community that ultimately may not even have access to that, right? And how do we use either funds, spaces, or just our education to feed it back into the community and start mobilizing the young ones, right? And building, like AFQ was saying, across generations, and building a solid front together. And I think burnout happens because we don't help each other, right? And it's one person doing everything, and that's exhausting. So I think the best way to self-care and to prevent that is having each other's back. If you say you're gonna show up and be there, and really care about the person you're organizing with, because if they're your best friend, you're not gonna let them down, and you're gonna be there through the thick and the thin.
Thank you for that. And I haven't seen anyone else's hands pop up, so maybe I'll just add on another question to extend that in regards to coalition building. So what are some ways that you all have done effective coalition building in the past, and what has worked, right, to create some of those intersectional frameworks and to get more people involved with movements that you've been a part of? Or maybe what didn't work and you learned from that could have gone better.
I think what has worked for me in coalition is like understanding really that everyone is different and has their own stories and their own experiences, and you can't really switch a person or a movement. Right? But instead, you can find a common theme to build a coalition on. So like the theme of like, what is that one thing that we have in common in our experiences, or the things that we have gone through, and that's how you build a coalition, right? So finding that commonality without necessarily changing or like having to change your mission or purpose in the world. So that's one of the things I just want to offer that. And I think it's really important then to build that community first, and then find common ground and then mobilize. So I feel like this is going back to the 2016, like what do we do now post 2016 question. So I think what people are really looking for is like to build community, and not necessarily like moving right into action, but just finding like that community, that sense of like, you matter, you are value, we're in this together, we're going through this thing. And because it was really heavy, and even me after 2016, I didn't want to do anything because it was a lot. But just finding that community that I can like talk to and mobilize and talk about what I'm still feeling from 2016, right? So yeah.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Perla. And so we're running up on the 5:30 mark. So if people do have to start to leave, I totally understand. I think that we have maybe about a little bit of time that we could go over, hopefully, because I know we had a lot of great content today and probably a lot of ideas. One of our ground rules in OSA is expect unfinished business, right? So this is the start of conversations, and the point of the teach-ins is, the education components, and then some of the mobilization that we'll be doing in the near future. So I'm gonna pass the last response off to AFQ, and then after AFQ is done, I have some asks for people here So they're two like main important asks that we're going to be doing for our next mobilizing efforts. So I'll give it to AFQ and then I'll pass it back to myself just to finish this off here, and then we'll be done for today.
Cool. Yeah, I think that one quick anecdote from when I was a student at U of O of a campaign that kind of happened in which we did some coalition building, and I feel like there were some good things that happened and some bad things to happen that were lessons. Basically, there was kind of a big controversy and problem in which student RAs, resident assistants in the dorms, found out after they had already signed their contracts to be RAs for the year that they were then mandatory reporters for survivors of sexual assault. And I think Reese was around during that time. Hi, nice to see you again. And Lucero was there, and it was like a big thing. Everyone's like, one, that mandatory reporting policies are just really proven to not be supportive to survivors of sexual assault. It can be really traumatizing. And two, also that there are these RAs that are already now being told that, it's their obligation, they're contractually obligated. It was like kind of a clarification of their contracts that they were now mandatory reporters. And I think actually what was good is that, some folks started to come together to see a lot of different folks who were organizing campus on in different ways, in different communities that could come together to organize around this. So we had the actual RAs themselves, these are folks that are directly affected in one way. There was, at the time, what was the Women's Center, was what we called on campus, that really was like the hub of a lot of survivor organizing. The LGBTQ Center also was a big hub of survivor organizing. And then there was a newly formed, I was one of the co-founders of a group called SLAP, the Student Labor Action Project at U of O. That was our old inside joke. So that we started to kind of come together, and we're like, and also, sorry, I should also name it, also the student government, many members of the student government also were like, this is a major campus issue and we need to address it. And then there were some new organizations that started to get formed even out of this crisis. And I think what was somewhat at its best, what started to happen was a lot of folks RAs didn't often necessarily organize or get involved with other groups or campaigns on campus. A lot of these groups hadn't necessarily organized together, but started to come together because they were different stakeholders in different ways by folks who were affected or had experience with this. What didn't go well is that there was, I think that there were some pretty bad meetings that happened, and one in particular, which folks are starting to kind of come together, and there started to be some turf wars and stuff. There was one individual, this white dude, who felt a lot of ownership of I am the owner of this issue. People have to ask me for permission to work on this. And was I need to be the convener. I need to be the facilitator. I need to be this, this, and this. And it became super, super toxic. And people were pissed. They're who are you? And the reality is this didn't belong to any one person or any one group. Everyone actually had a role, was affected, or could be, be in service in different ways. And that really broke trust. It really stifled organizing and coalition building. And so I just think that's a big lesson. I think that that was an example of I feel he was 100% in the wrong. But also I do think that there's a thing sometimes in coalition building where just acknowledging different folks will feel ownership in different ways, in some ways that could be legitimate or you might feel aren't legitimate, but you have to actually navigate that and hopefully have a strong enough relationships, I think, as folks have said, to be able to do that, and also be able to call out or push out those who are in the way of it. And so, yeah, that was one example of that. And the last thing, just to go back to the some the disillusionment after 2016, there's a lot that that we don't really have that much power over on the national level, especially Oregon, if we talk about a presidential election of how much influence does Oregon have in that and stuff. And, I remember clipboarding and registering students to vote and doing GOTV, and people will bring that up all the time. And honestly, in some ways they're right. That there's very little ways in which it's limited in a lot of ways on some of the bigger national things that have people really disillusioned. But the amazing thing is that like actually there's so much that could be won at the local level. And so that can be the motivating factor for people of like, you know, there's already been so much groundwork put into things at the statewide level or on the campus-wide level. And people just want to be a part of something that they think is actually like winnable or meaningful and not get their hopes up about like something that's not going to happen. And so I think that just like figuring out what those things are and bringing people in, like people just like really want to like win some shit. And so like what's winnable right now? Yeah.
All right, great. Well, that is all the time that we have for questions right now. So thank you all so much, panelists. It has been really wonderfully insightful. There's definitely a lot of things I feel like I took out of it. And I hope that all of the at-large attendees have also gotten something out of this and feel a little spark of something to keep the movement going. Now, one thing or two things that I want to mention really quickly before we wrap up here is that I am going to be throwing in a link right now, and I want everyone to pull that up and register. And so this is a webinar with our coalition partner, Partners for a Hunger-Free Oregon. The webinar is going to be on June 1st at 1 p.m. And so this webinar is in collaboration with the work that we did for something called listening circles or campus listening circles with partners throughout winter term, where we talked to a smaller intimate group of students from a few college campuses around food and housing insecurity issues. And obviously, as we've seen from COVID, these issues that were already a crisis before the pandemic have been more exacerbated. And so this is going to be a webinar where the first part of it will talk about those listening circles and some of the common trends that were noticed. And then we're also going to be having a conversation around what is going to be impactful and meaningful policy that we can collaborate on for a strong 2021 long legislative session. And so please take the time to register for that if you are willing and able. The other thing too is that since everyone has their email that registered, we're going to be reaching out for story collection around how you and your peers have been impacted around COVID. I think that it's really important to talk about some of the frameworks that AFQ mentioned in terms of the symbolic, and Oregon is going to be facing a lot of cuts with COVID-19 and the issues that happened around unemployment and our dependency that we talked about in our previous teach-ins around things like income taxes as a source of revenue and the ballot measure 5 and divestment from state revenue from property taxes. And so Oregon for this biennium is looking at probably about a $2.7 billion shortfall. And we really, really need to make sure that students are being heard during the conversations when the state legislature most likely will be reconvening for a special session, to make sure that the stories are on the forefront of these decision makers' mind, so that we can make sure that we're not just having a conversation around balancing the budgets, but we do have that symbolic factor of these are the days and lives of experiences that people are experiencing as students around these issues. And so that email template is going to be going out to you all. If you can commit to writing a letter based off of that template, and then getting 2 to 3 of your peers as well to write that letter, so that we can have good turnout to make sure that we can have a lot of visibility around those issues, that's going to be the next movement that we're going to be doing as an OSA coalition, at least. So that is my asks to you all. Once again, thank you all so much for coming today. Thank you so much for the panelists. And I am really excited to see a lot of the conversations that came out of today, as well as some of the momentum that can be built from a lot of the insights that you all as panelists gave, and then you all as attendees. Also, just being here, like Lucero said, we have 20 people in our rooms right now, no cleanup, no mess with that. And we've also had some really powerful conversations about coalition building and student power. So once again, thank you all so much. This has been amazing, and I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.